So today I'm going to be talking about the effects of overharvesting coastal old-growth forests. This topic is important to me because I grew up close to the coast in BC and was surrounded by red cedars predominantly, and I just think they're super cool trees. So the topics that I'm going to be going over are the harvesting historically and currently of western red cedar forests, as well as their ecological importance, their cultural importance, and also how we can preserve or conserve these forests for future generations. So, historically and presently, the harvesting of coastal old growth forests has been, they've used the method of clear cutting predominantly, and it's really a good method for the logging industry because they can just boom chop down all the trees, get those going into production, but it doesn't really leave any habitat for species that require these forests for survival, and it also makes it really hard for the trees to regenerate and for regrowth when there's a huge clear cut, because they don't do the best in clear open settings for regeneration. They get targeted by browsers and grazers that'll eat their branches, or they'll get outcompeted by other tree species that grow much faster than them because they are a slow growing species. So clear cutting is a great method for logging and wood productivity, like the logging industry, but not so much for our ecosystems. So, what they do when they're clear cutting, they also just use a high grading method on top of that. And a high grading method is any harvesting method that removes only the most valuable timber and leaves the rest of the wood behind. So say they're gonna clear cut all these trees and there's some that are just too small, they wouldn't be able to get any wood products out of them, they'll just leave them behind on the forest floor. So it's really unnecessary to cut those trees down if they're just gonna leave them behind. But that's a method that's been commonly used because really, why would you take wood that's not so valuable when you can take like the super valuable big woods like seen in this picture here? And that's also kind of ruining these ecosystems because it doesn't give those smaller trees a chance to grow and get to a size where they could be considered old growth. And old growth, because they are a slow growing tree, is really hard to come by. So the harvesting methods, red cedar is really high in value in Canada and also internationally as a wood product. They're popular for decks, roofing, siding, fencing, pretty much anything, any wood product or item that you'd have outside. And it's popular because of its heartwood, and its heartwood is really strong, durable, and weather resistant. Even if you cut down the tree and you leave the bark on after the tree's dead, the heartwood can survive for like so long and it'll stay durable well after the tree's dead. And that's what's most commonly sought after when they're harvesting these old growth cedar trees. But they are a declining tree species, like the old growth ones, at least on the coast in BC, because they've been highly targeted and harvested in the past and continue to be. They also hold ecological importance. So they're important habitat for many species, but two that I found and kind of spoke to me the most were the northern spotted owl and the American marten. The northern spotted owl has a few different populations across North America, but in the coastal old growth forests, they've been like really declining because of the logging industry and the loss of habitat. So their populations, researchers have found, have gone down from 500 pairs, so that's like 1,000 individuals in these forests, down to 3 since the industrial logging started. And that's a huge decline. Like, we have been logging for many, many years, but that's still so unfortunate. Like, they're on the risk of extinction in these coastal old growth forests. And then as well, there's the American marten that need these dead standing trees that have been hollowed out by woodpeckers or beetles or whatever's attacking it for their preferred sheltering sites. And if we're cutting down all the trees, leaving behind the ones we don't care too much about, they can be useful on the ground, but it's way more useful just to leave them standing to provide shelter, habitat, and all this stuff. nutrients, shelter for regeneration of other trees. So all those things combined, it's really impacting not only the regeneration of trees, but the species that live in these forests and rely on them for shelter and growth in life. Oh, sorry. These trees are also culturally important to the coastal First Nations people. They have been historically and continue to be used to make items such as bowls and dishes and clothing, hats, baskets, nets, canoes and paddles, and traditional longhouses. They are a super good tree for stuff like nets and baskets because of their flexible branches, so you can bend them pretty good before they'll actually snap. Like, it takes a lot to erect these branches, and their flexible bark as well is super valuable to them and the items that they need to survive, and they use these trees and so, a lot of the time keep them standing. Like canoes obviously are going to take like the whole tree, but for those smaller items they usually just strip the bark of the tree and can use that to make their item and leave that tree still standing, because the tree will regenerate and will grow around the portion that's been taken and can still survive for long after just a select portion has been taken. And so we refer to those trees as culturally modified trees. That's a sustainable method of using this wood and harvesting it without actually destroying the ecosystem. And these culturally modified trees that have been historically used are actually protected under BC legislation. The Western red cedar is known as a cultural keystone species. So some of the ways we can preserve or conserve this old growth forest would be using a harvesting method like variable retention instead of clear cutting. It's got positive effects on many organisms that rely on these forests for survival compared to clear cutting. And it leaves canopy trees for shelter for other organisms and also for shelter for regeneration of the Western red cedar. Like I had mentioned before, they need a little bit of shelter to protect them from the elements and organisms that may feed on them. So variable retention will leave stands and leave sections of trees to provide that habitat that they kind of need to regrowth and for the animals like the American marten or the northern spotted owl. We could also create protected areas or more parks that would preserve the land and the forests and make sure that nothing's really logged, so these forests can continue to thrive for future generations to enjoy and for organisms to survive in. But it would also impact our logging operations, as Western red cedar is a highly valuable logging species. So Western red cedars are a slow growing species compared to others, like I mentioned, and so it's not really easy to get back those old growth forests once they've been logged. So yeah, it's like, oh well, the cedars will just grow back, but it takes like hundreds, maybe even like 1,000 years for these old growth forests to come to be. So thinking, oh yeah, they'll just grow back isn't really a great mindset to think about when moving forward. So yeah, losing these rare old growth stands would be devastating, not only as a useful resource, but also poses threats to our diverse ecosystems and cultures. So I believe it's super important to kind of think about the impact that we have on these forests. And it's not only old growth forests that we have, it's all forests, our logging operations. We really need to think about how we go about things and what might be affected by the way we do things to make sure that we have forests that last for the rest of time. Thank you.